Well, it's a sober day today. There seems to be blustery wind and a different atmosphere. The sun's in a different angle, and I feel a briskness in the air. Perhaps the summer is over. Perhaps the later seasons of the year are upon us. There's a book in the New Testament that has some rather blunt and plain language. Some of the people that it is addressing are spiritually in peril. The aim of this book is to pull people back from the brink, because some of them are clearly drifting away from the teaching of Jesus Christ and the apostles. What was their problem? Why were these people on the verge of losing out? And how would it be possible to get through to people? When people have an idea in their minds, it's extremely difficult to shift it. Think of yourself when you've got something you've stumbled on or an idea that occurs. It's kind of difficult to get somebody to move that aside or give it up. We're talking about the book of Hebrews, a book toward the end of the New Testament. And this book is written to Jewish Christians in the first century. Now, most Jewish Christians lived in Jerusalem and the land of Judea. Of course, there were many scattered throughout the diaspora around the Roman Empire, but the concentration was there in Judea and especially in Jerusalem. It was a large city. This letter seems to have been written in the early 60s AD. We find that the temple is still standing when this letter was written. But there's no mention of the terrible war with the Romans that broke out in the middle 60s AD and continued right up until the final destruction of the nation, and in particular Jerusalem, which was really burnt to the ground at that time. So the time of this letter, Hebrews, is probably just after the end of the book of Acts. When you read the book of Acts, you read about Paul's first imprisonment, and that's coming to an end, and that seems to be the very early 60s. So this book would seem to fit in at about that time, the early 60s AD. Now, the readers would not have been novices. They were not newcomers to the Christian faith. So what prompted this hard-hitting and strongly corrective letter? We can see immediately in chapter 1 the type of emphasis that we're going to find in this book. Every few verses we see also a quote from the Old Testament. So everything that is said is backed up by Scripture, constant references to the Old Testament all the way through the book of Hebrews. More rapid references than any other part of the New Testament except the book of Revelation. Now, the opening verses of chapter 1 in Hebrews give us a clue about the direction that this letter is going to take. Hebrews 1 verse 1 says, God, who at sundry times, various times, and in divers manners spoke in times past to the fathers. And how did he do it? By the prophets. And verse 2, he has in these last days spoken to us by his Son. And then the rest of this first chapter shows how much greater Christ is than even the angels with their angelic offices and responsibilities. Down in verse 13, toward the end of chapter 1. But to which of the angels said he at any time, sit at my right hand, until I make your enemies your footstool? So we need to read between the lines here, and we can see that the Christians who were receiving this letter had been focusing on, among other things, the prophets, the heroes of the Old Testament. Remember, the prophet represented God to the people, and the priest represented the people to God. Now, these Christians in Judea had begun to focus on the prophets and the other heroes, and also on the angels. This was obviously very much on their mind. And we have to ask, were they losing a right balance? Perhaps even forgetting what Christ had said and done. When they looked into their scriptures, they didn't see on the surface too much about Jesus there. In chapter 2 of Hebrews, things become even more hard-hitting. Chapter 2, verse 1, therefore, we ought to give the more earnest heed to the things we have heard. What have you learnt over the years? Don't forget it. He says, give the more earnest heed to the things we've heard, lest at any time we should let them slip. Well, things are maybe a little clearer as we go on. These people were beginning to let things slip. Verse 3, how shall we escape if we neglect so great salvation, which began to be spoken by the Lord, and was confirmed to us by them that heard him? So the original apostles that walked and lived with Jesus had passed on the information to this next generation. And we need to heed what we learnt from them and from the Lord himself. You'd better wake up, is what the writer is saying. Don't neglect the core of your faith. Because if you do, you'll be in danger of losing everything. Well, up to now, we've seen a glimpse of perhaps how these readers were getting off course. But where did it all end up? Where were they? What stage of the game were they at when we read this letter? How had they started to neglect so great salvation, as we read in this verse? Well, we're going to take a shortcut. We're going to try and get to the root of the problem quickly, and we'll skim ahead to Hebrews chapter 10. Hebrews chapter 10, when he's in the heart of his discourse and argument. In Hebrews chapter 10, verse 3, now this chapter 10, we're reading all about the sacrificial system, which was the heart and core of Judaism, and it was obviously in full swing at the temple at the time this is written. Hebrews 10, verse 3. But in these sacrifices, there is a remembrance, again, made of sins every year. So these sacrifices had to be constantly repeated. They were a reminder every year of the people's sins. Verse 4, Hebrews 10 verse 4. For it is impossible that the blood of bulls and goats should take away sin. And down to verse 11. Every priest stands daily ministering and offering oftentimes the same sacrifice, which of course can never take away sin. How could an animal's life, the writer is saying, how could the death of an animal ever change your relationship with God? It should be so obvious. An animal dying would alter your relationship with God. And verse 12, but this man, he's talking of Jesus, this man, after he offered one sacrifice for sin forever, sat down on the right hand of God. We're in a different ballpark here. This is nothing you can compare. What Christ did is so far and away beyond the death of no matter how many animals. This man sat down at the right hand of God. So the picture is becoming a little clearer for us. These Christians in Judea were beginning to turn back to the old sacrifices that they were so familiar with. This had probably been their experience in their youth. Maybe these are things they learnt at their mother's knee. This was part of their DNA, all the events at the temple. Once again, these people were beginning to look to the animal sacrifices as a means of forgiveness. And somehow they need to be rescued from this blind alley. Now surely, we might think, if these were long-term Christians, shouldn't they have known better? What would have got into them? Surely that would never bother you and me. Well, of course, we didn't grow up in that environment. We didn't grow up with the temple and all the rigmarole and the ceremonies. That wasn't part of our life. We may go back to some of our early ideas, ups and downs, weaknesses. You know, we're sometimes tempted to go back to our old habits. Perhaps that was the case with them. But the writer here obviously knows what the problems of these people are. It looks as if the elders in Judea had become very concerned with the spiritual well-being of their flock. And they must have asked for this letter to be written. Find somebody who carries weight and authority that will really shake up these members. Somebody had to try to call a halt to this slide back to relying on the Levitical sacrifices for the forgiveness of sin. But how is it possible to get through to these perhaps quite earnest people? How do you change somebody else's mind? It's not an easy matter, is it? It's a conundrum. Now, the writer must have turned this problem over and over in his mind. How to show them that an animal's death would never forgive their sin. How could he show them in a convincing manner that these Levitical sacrifices were not the real answer. They weren't the ultimate answer. They weren't the solution to their sins. How could he persuade these Christians that they were headed in a wrong direction? How could he reinvigorate, you might say, their understanding of all that Christ had accomplished? The brilliant solution that he came up with is of huge interest to you and me today. We can read the book of Hebrews and perhaps we just take it as given, but it has made a central part of our Christian belief. You see, the high point of this entire system of sacrifices came around each year on the Day of Atonement. Right there at the temple in Jerusalem, an elaborate ritual was acted out. 5 beasts were involved, including, in particular, 2 goats. You can read the details when you go back to Leviticus chapter 16. But it's quite difficult to follow it all through. And most people are left with a huge question mark at the end of that chapter. What on earth was all that about? A great conundrum. Every year, an atonement or a covering for sin. This is the word kippur, Yom Kippur. The word kippur is covering, used to cover the ark with pitch. A covering. Every year, an atonement or a covering of sin had to be made for the entire nation. Sometimes people say, well, is this like the Passover? Well, no. At the Old Testament Passover, the attention was on the individual. Each individual family. Here, the emphasis is on the entire nation, even the entire world. There's a different weight of emphasis. Now, the writer of this book must have thought long and hard about this complex ritual, reenacted year after year, on this, perhaps the most sober of all the festival days. Finally, and I'm sure with God's help, he sees that there is a picture there. He sees in all these goings and comings and toing and froing of the high priest, he sees a symbolism. He sees an unveiling of a part of God's purpose that no one had ever seen before, at least not in such clarity. He realizes that here is a sort of coded message. It had never really been fully understood. Up to that time, it foreshadows and it explains much of the work and the sacrifice that Jesus had ultimately carried out. He sees, when he thinks over the events of this day, he sees that a drama is being acted out. And he sees that this drama reveals an office that Jesus Christ holds to this day. He can use this understanding. He can use this vivid imagery, this new understanding, this new truth. He can use this to wake up many of these Christians in Judea who were moving down a slippery slope. They were thinking, that after all, perhaps an animal's death is what would free them from sin and the penalty of sin. They couldn't be more wrong. In the events of this day, attention often fell on the two goats among the animals that were involved. In particular, Judaism had focused on the second goat, the one that was led away into the wilderness, carrying the sins of the nation. The goat was led far away, never to return. I spoke to a Jew about this one time. I said, well, how many miles did they go? He said, well, actually, they wanted to go above and beyond what the Bible said. They would normally chase this goat to the edge of a cliff and make sure the poor goat jumped out into space. They wanted to make sure that he would never, ever return. But the writer of Hebrews doesn't talk about that event. He doesn't feel he needs to go there. It's another part of the symbolism, and many things are included on this day. I think that was mentioned in the opening prayer. Many different factors are involved. But the writer knows that there is something else even more pressing. So instead, the writer concentrates on the rest of this ritual, all the work and the actions that were carried out by the high priest. And this is the subject of Hebrews chapter 8 and chapter 9 and chapter 10. If we look at Hebrews chapter 9, he works through this subject, and it's fairly heavy going, but in another way, he's making relatively light work of it, because he's actually giving the explanation rather than just the blow-by-blow account of what has to be done. Here in Hebrews 9 verse 2, in this first run around back in the Old Testament times, when the sanctuary was built, he says in verse 2, there was a tabernacle made with two rooms. The first, he says, wherein was the candlestick and the table and the showbread. That was called the sanctuary. So the first room, that's the sanctuary. Then in verse 3, and after the second veil, so you had to go through a curtain, a veil, to get into the first room, and then you had to go beyond a second veil to get into the second room. Verse 3, after the second veil, or curtain, the tabernacle, or room, which is called the holiest of all, the Holy of Holies. Down in verse 7. Now into this second room went the high priest alone, only once every year, not without blood, which he offered first for himself and then for the errors of the people. It was a scary business going into the inner sanctum. Anyone that would venture there, it was instant death. And even if the high priest went there at any other time, or if he went in without blood, it was instant death. They tied a rope around his foot when he went in case he died when he was in there, because there would be no way they could get him out unless they pulled him by the rope. So into the second room went the high priest once every year, not without blood, which he offered for himself and the errors of the people. What is it? What is it that the writer is so intent on explaining? What is it that he's going to reveal? What is it that he wants to lay bare to get through to the minds of people that are losing the plot? Let's backtrack for a few moments to see how this problem had arisen. So many of these Christians in Judea, how could they be going off the boil? Now, after the day of Pentecost that we read about in Acts chapter 2, the beginning of the book of Acts, we read that tens of thousands of Jews were converted. Right there on that first day, remember, thousands responded to Peter's sermon. And in the next chapter, again, thousands more. And so we go on. In Acts chapter 5, we see that this crescendo, this pace was, if anything, building up. It didn't diminish. We read here in the book of Acts, in chapter 5, verse 14, that in the following months, many more were converted. This is Acts chapter 5, verse 14. Acts chapter 5, verse 14. And believers were the more added to the Lord. Multitudes, myriads. The indication is many thousands. Multitudes, both men and women. So we're talking multiple thousands here that were swelling the ranks of the church. Those early years must have been exciting years, full of growth, full of activity, a voyage of discovery into a new way of life. And of course, many would have continued to meet in the temple and its precincts, as they had always done. There'd always be a bit of a buzz there at the temple, all the events going on, the paraphernalia, meeting friends. It was an exciting experience. But of course, local congregations and house churches, they would have multiplied throughout Judea in those early years. I think it would have been rather difficult to keep up with the pace of things if you were trying to put names and addresses or, pigeon numbers in your notebook. I don't know how they communicated without telephones, but it would have been difficult to keep up with the explosive growth. And the book of Acts talks about many miracles that took place, especially in the early chapters. Now here in Acts 5, verse 15, notice, Acts 5, the next verse, verse 15. It was to such an extent they even brought forth the sick into the streets and laid them on beds or couches, that at least the shadow of Peter passing by might overshadow some of them. What an amazing time to be called into the church. Quick, quick, one of the apostles is coming. Try and get in this alleyway where the sun will cast a shadow. What a time to have lived. All these events would have added to the confidence of these early Christians. They knew Jesus was coming back. The apostles had told them so. The apostles said it's going to be very soon. Any day now. Do you remember in Acts chapter 1 when the disciples were with Jesus on the Mount of Olives? In verse 6, they asked Jesus, "Is this it? Here we are on the Mount of Olives. You died and you've risen from the grave. Is this it? Is it now? Is this the beginning of your kingdom?" But Jesus is about to ascend into heaven, and he leaves them guessing. Well, they continue to think that the return must be very soon. And we can see this expectation in many of the letters in the New Testament, where the writer will say, when we meet him in the air, when, they assume it's going to be in their lifetime and perhaps very soon. But the months of waiting turned into years. And the years became decades. And miracles were becoming less frequent. And the Bible tells us that with persecution, many of the members were scattered, and numbers began to dwindle. Obviously, the temple would have continued to attract people. It was a center of stability in a difficult world, and it would have drawn God-fearing people just like a magnet. Now, after the first 12 chapters of the book of Acts, we read very little about the church in Jerusalem. The story in Acts takes us to different parts of the Roman Empire. We're going on an all-paid cruise. It doesn't cost us a penny to take these wonderful cruises all over the Mediterranean. And Paul does continue to pay visits to Jerusalem from time to time, or so it seems. The apostles begin to move away from Jerusalem to other areas. But Paul, when he comes to Jerusalem, it seems that he visits the temple. It was still very much a focal point for these Judean Christians. But the years were continuing to pass. The early years of excitement and growth were beginning to be a fading memory. And Jesus hadn't returned. Perhaps his life and death was not as important as it had once seemed. Perhaps it wasn't all that it was cracked up to be. But at least there was lively activity in the temple. Perhaps that was where they could find answers to the questions in their religious lives. So this is the problem that the elders in Judea were faced with in the 60s AD. The brethren beginning to lose sight of Jesus' sacrifice. And to try and deal with this problem, we have our letter. In this book of Hebrews, what the writer does is to take us straight to the heart of the Levitical system and the climax on the Day of Atonement. The main figure here in Hebrews is the high priest. And the writer has made a discovery. He realizes that everything the high priest does is a picture, a detailed picture. In Hebrews 9, we discover that what the high priest is doing is a type of simulation. The high priest is representing somebody. Back to Hebrews chapter 9, verse 7. We were here a little while ago. Hebrews chapter 9, verse 7. But into this second room, the Holy of Holies, the inner sanctum, into this second room went the high priest alone, once every year, not without blood, which he offered for himself and for the errors, for the sins of the people. Verse 9, Hebrews 9, verse 9. This was a figure, an illustration for the time then present. This was a picture he's telling the people back then. when both gifts and sacrifices were offered, this is Hebrews 9 verse 9, but, the writer adds, these could never make him that did the service perfect. No matter how much blood he took in, no matter where he sprinkled it, that animal's blood could never solve even the problems of the high priest himself. The high priest was just a man, but he was acting out symbolically what eventually Christ would do. Now the penny drops. This man in the priest's office was representing in a temporary way the Messiah himself and his spiritual office. It was Jesus himself, who was the ultimate, the true high priest. Now this is a revelation that is not explained anywhere else in the New Testament. It looks as though at this time, the time the book of Hebrews was written, it looks as though it's the first time that this understanding had been made available by God. In verse 11, Hebrews 9, verse 11, but Christ, being come a high priest of good things to come, by a greater and more perfect tabernacle, not made with hands. We're not looking at a physical building, not of this building. So the writer is saying there's something in heaven which the building on earth pictured. There's a spiritual, a heavenly temple that Christ has entered, just as the human man entered a physical building. Verse 12, Hebrews 9, verse 12. Neither by the blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood, he entered in once into the holy place. This is Jesus Christ, having obtained eternal redemption for us, you and me. These local Christians have been attracted back to the elaborate ceremonies performed by the priesthood, and in particular by the high priest. But they had failed to realize what it all pictured. They failed to realize that, I don't want to use the word charade because that is an almost negative feeling, but you know what I mean. It was a scene, almost like a scene from a play. And these Christians had not got the point. Now in this book, starting at the end of chapter 2 of Hebrews, and all the way through, time and again, the point is driven home that it is Christ who holds this high office. Back in chapter 2 of Hebrews, down in verse 17, chapter 2, in verse 17. Wherefore, in all things, it behoved him to be made like to his brethren. He was human, made like us. He was human. Just like you, just like me. Why did Jesus have to live as a human being? It goes on, that he might be, in verse 17, a merciful and faithful high priest. And at the end of verse 17, to make reconciliation for the sins of the people. Verse 18, Hebrews 2 verse 18. For in that he himself has suffered, being tested or tried, he is able to help those that are tested. That's us, once again. Because he went through it all, he can help us. And then in chapter 3, verse 1, Therefore, holy brethren, partakers of the heavenly calling, consider the apostle and high priest of our profession, Christ Jesus. And in verse 14, chapter 3, verse 14, again and again, seeing then that we have a great high priest that is passed into the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast to our profession. And again in Hebrews 4, verse 15, for we have not a high priest who cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities, our troubles, but was in all points tested as we are, yet without sin. He understands. He knows all about your trouble. He knows all about your stress and strain, your loneliness, your tiredness, your sickness. He knows it all. And so the writer continues, all through this most unusual book, a dozen times, he talks about Jesus as high priest. Now, if you're reading right through the book of Hebrews, which I'd encourage you to do, you'll find in chapters 5 and 6 and 7 that the importance of the priesthood of Jesus Christ is even more explained. It's further explained, chapters 5, 6 and 7. We find that it is the rather mysterious and fascinating priesthood of Melchizedek that we read about back in the book of Genesis at the time of Abraham. In Hebrews 5 verse 10, he explains this by quoting from Psalm 110. He's quoting from the Old Testament constantly to prove his points as he goes through. So he didn't leave anything to chance. He's backing up by the words that they believed were scripture. Here in Hebrews 5:10, he quotes Psalm 110. He says, called of God, a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. So the high priesthood of Christ, we are told, belongs to an age long before the time of the Levites, long before the Levitical sacrifices were brought on the scene. And so therefore this priesthood of Jesus Christ is far superior to anything that might have been there with the Levites. But could these readers understand what is being said? Could they get all these things? Verse 11, he's talking about this priesthood of Melchizedek. And he says in verse 11, of who we have many things to say. I've begun to see pictures here that I never understood before. So the writer's going to get excited. There are so many things I'd like to explain about this, but they're hard to understand, at least as far as you lot are concerned. That's what he's saying. Because he says in verse 11, you're dull of hearing. You're a bit on the thick side, spiritually speaking. You ought to understand these things, but you don't. Instead of getting sidetracked into odd ideas, which it's so easy for people to be trapped into, instead of, in this case, thinking that somehow they could be forgiven by the animal sacrifices, they should be growing spiritually. And if they were studying the scriptures, they would have known better. He's just explained some of this from the book of Psalms. You know, it's pretty clear in the Old Testament. Psalm 40, verse 6, written centuries before. Psalm 40, verse 6, in burnt offerings and sacrifices for sin, God has no pleasure. David understood that 1,000 years before, and they didn't. They'd lost it. They weren't familiar enough with their Bibles. This is why they were going off the rails. But now, today, as a result of this, you and I can learn so much from this book. As a result of this letter, written in a strong and corrective manner, the purpose being to lead these people away from a false idea, looking at an animal sacrifice as the solution to their sin. As a result of all of this, and the letter that had to be written, you and I are able to understand who the real high priest is. A lot about this special festival day is explained here in the book of Hebrews that would not be understood otherwise. You and I understand who the real high priest is. We discover much of the meaning of this day. When you read about it in the Hebrew scriptures, it's quite difficult to work out what the different actions of the high priest symbolize or picture. Exactly what is he doing and why is he doing it? This book shows us that Jesus, through the difficulties that he faced, is more than able to help us in our many troubles. We discover that God deals with sin once and for all, not only for us, but for the whole world. And this office that Jesus Christ holds, a high priest forever, is at the heart of our faith. At baptism, we're usually asked, do you accept Jesus Christ as your Saviour and your high priest? And we answer, I do, before we're baptized. So it's a vital part of our understanding. Verse 24, Hebrews 9, verse 24. Hebrews 9, verse 24. For Christ is not entered into the holy places made with hands. He hasn't gone into an earthly, physical temple. These things are a figure, they're a picture, they're a symbol of the true. But Jesus has entered into heaven itself now to appear in the presence of God for us. That's something worth knowing. That's something worth remembering. We have an advocate with God himself. No wonder we're encouraged to come boldly to the throne of grace.